Okay, and next we have Varnoth, the Black Blade, book number 1, a LitRPG story written by Lavelle Jackson. It is 344 pages, $2.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited, and here's the author's description. What would you do if you woke up without memory, crucified and on the brink of death? Varnoth the Shadow Panther must struggle to survive in the cruel world of Albattara. He must use his natural-born skills in his fantasy LitRPG to explore the land, complete quests, conquer dungeons, craft potions, destroy terrifying monsters, and find answers to his questions. Who is he? Why was he crucified? So there we go. Full disclosure, I received an advance copy for review of the novel. I purchased a copy when it came. I actually purchased 2 because I want to be supportive of this author. In addition to that, you should be aware that Lavelle Jackson is the host of the Lit Reroll podcast, where he does LitRPG reviews, and he's a member of the community. And you know, I like the guy. I've had interactions with him on a semi-regular basis. So just full disclosure of that particular relationship. This novel is the author's first novel. And he's undoubtedly nervous about how this story is going to be received. I can absolutely empathize with that. And I try to be super supportive of an author when he's first publishing, especially if it's the first thing he's published. Like, because I remember that feeling doing that myself. So I try to be empathetic about that. I even bought 2 separate copies, not Kindle Unlimited, bought 2 separate copies of the story just to be supportive of somebody I like and somebody who I can empathize with, essentially. However, as a review of LitRPG, the review has to be 100% honest. So I want to make sure that's perfectly clear. So there are issues with the story that essentially stopped me from really enjoying it. The author initially wrote this on the real road as almost this serial story. And you can kind of tell there are shifts in the storyline. But he has a nice following there. There are people who've really enjoyed it online and they left nice reviews on Amazon. So it's not like nobody likes this. But for me, there were some larger story issues, especially with some of the game mechanics, that just stopped me from enjoying it. But if those things I'm going to talk about don't bother you, give it a read, man. I mean, seriously, go give this a chance. Either way, give the author a shot. Just realize what you're getting into. And I always try to be completely honest about things that may bother people. This is a first novel. This is a first story publishing. And sometimes it kind of shows. And I'm not saying that to be mean or anything. I'm just like, oh, this writing has potential, and it's going to get better. I don't know, as long as the author continues to work on improving the story, improving his craft. But there are things in the novel that I'm not going to talk about. It's like, oh, these are, yep, I remember doing that myself, or like, kind of stuff like that. So I'm just, if you're going to purchase this and you're going to spend money on it, you have to be aware of that. I think that's only fair. So there we go. But again, I still encourage you to give it a chance if you want to be supportive of the author. Okay, stuff I liked. I like the main character. He's actually an interesting character. He's not human. I genuinely like that part of it. It was nice to see a non-human protagonist who gave a little bit of a different experience. He's in the way he's described in his thought processes, he's mostly human. So I'll say that. 2, the RPG progression is a part of the story consistently. So I did enjoy the fact that the RPG stuff was throughout the novel. It seemed to matter to various degrees, but it is consistently applied at least. 3, there's a nice variety of monsters and enemies. So you get a nice different groupings of creatures to fight. The story is very focused on action, which is always a big plus for me. 5, after the 30% mark in the story actually takes a very interesting dark turn that I think some readers are gonna enjoy. Like, it gets a heck of a lot more graphic. The stuff that enemies and bad guys do it's a lot darker. And even some of the actions of the main character definitely take on a darker tone. And I think that's probably going to be a highlight for some readers who get that far. Okay. Issues. This is a longer list, unfortunately. And again, it's a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about is stuff that's like, oh, this is storytelling stuff that the author is going to figure out at some point. Or it's like game mechanics where it's like, oh, this might have been fixed with a little tweaking or like an expansion in some spots. But I can only judge the novel by what I'm given, not by what it can potentially be. So for me, here we go. Combat is probably my biggest pet peeve with this novel, and it was such a big deal. In my brain, I kind of had to just accept at some point that the combat was going to be this way. Otherwise, I would have had to stop reading. Combat almost always goes the main character's way, with very little effort, and usually with him not getting hurt. And it's kind of the biggest issue for me. Not because the fights are easy or because the main character comes off as overpowered, but because there's no RPG system in place that justifies it. And that's kind of it's a thing for my brain when I'm reading descriptions and then I'm looking at the stats and the numbers and the RPG mechanics, and they don't match up. Like, there's no justification for him being this overpowered, which means to me that there's like this, it's like this dissonance between the math and the descriptions, where my brain's like, no, this doesn't work in my brain, and it starts rolling off with numbers about why this doesn't work. And that's consistent throughout the novel. Like, the author, in all fairness, he warned me about this in advance of reading. He was like, Ramon, here's my thing to read. I think you might have an issue with this. I'm just letting you know in advance. And he was totally right. So that's fair. But again, my brain just couldn't like process. And just like some examples of like the main character often, not always, one shots his enemies, whether they're his level or not. A lot of times they're higher level than him. Some enemies are in complete armor, and they're in groups, and he one shots them all at the same time. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm like, I'd like to see the math behind that to see if that justifies it. And in other places, it's like the main character is saved by his fur, which is thick, and or his quickness. But like the same rules aren't applied to the enemies, whether they're human or monsters. And that to me, I was like, oh, that's like, that doesn't seem fair. Like, my brain literally has like this issue of like, I know the rules because he gave them to me. And I feel like they're not being applied in some instances, or like they're not being applied fairly. And that's an issue for my OCD brain sometimes. And again, that's me. If that stuff doesn't matter to you, it's not going to be an issue for you. There are other things like he's often like super skilled in every weapon he picks up, but there's no RPG justification. And it's not like that. I mean, this is something I'm putting up. The story, the game mechanics are established that, oh, people have weapon skills, and that's what makes them good. Like, there's another character in the story, he has I think it was like level 8 in archery, and she's a really good archer, but the main character picks up a bow for the first time, and again, he doesn't have memory, and he's magically amazing at it. The same thing with the short swords or like some other weapons. And it's like, oh, RPG system doesn't show that should be the case. And so there were a lot of things like that bothered me. There were also like legitimate things in the explain RPG system that aren't explained, but they exist. For example, this is probably the biggest one that kept bother me. The main character gains an increasing amount of attributes at every level, so they're not like consistent. It's not like he's gaining 10 stat points every level, right? Instead, at level 2, he gets 10 stat points. At level 3, he gets 12 stat points. At level 4, he gets 13 stat points. At level 10, he gets 18 stat points. And even if it was just like, oh, there was just like an extra 1 every time, or like 1 less than the level, whatever, that would be fine. But it's not consistent, and there's no explanation of why that happens, because those stat increases become a big part of why he becomes overpowered, even though he's overpowered the entire story. And I'm not saying there's not a reason for it, why this all occurs. It's just not explained to the reader, so it's like, oh, it just is. And so that always kind of bugged my brain, because again, it wasn't a consistent number, and it wasn't even a consistent increase in those numbers. And there's really no explanation of why that's the case. Like, a lot of the stuff is like, I feel like the author knows it in his brain, or he has it on paper, but he doesn't put it in the story so that I, as the reader, can also understand that. And again, I worked about the weapon skill stuff. The XP system sometimes felt like it was there to power level the main character. For example, like inconsistent XP for the same level monsters, quests that give bloated XP rewards for literally just kind of doing nothing. The biggest example would be the main character gets like 1,000 experience points for guarding a caravan. Only nothing happens during the trip, so he gets the XP for just literally sitting on a wagon going somewhere. Yes, some of this is sort of story justified, and that the main character has to fight a big bad guy who's like super higher level than him, which also never made sense because nobody's that high level. And there's no justification of how he got that high level, the bad guy anyways. But still, I totally understand it from a story perspective. The main character has to gain a lot of levels very quickly to face this bad guy at the end of the story, right? But because of the way it was done, like, it sometimes felt like the main character wasn't earning those levels and that power. And it was just, it bothered my brain again. And one of the other things, like, and this is more of a storytelling thing, the bad guys felt kind of flat. They were certainly really bad. Like that's one of the things that either it's going to enjoy or it's going to bug you is the description of the antagonist. They're all evil. Like they're really evil. Like the descriptions of some of the things they do in the story are like slightly disturbing. But they're definitely evil and bad. And so they're established as bad guys, but that's kind of the only note they have to them. There's nothing really else that's relatable to them. There's nothing like to make you even slightly empathetic. They're just like hardcore evil bad people. So when the main character comes and kills them or defeats them, great. You're like, oh yay, and it makes them look really good. It just wasn't as enjoyable because there's nothing more to any of the bad guys besides just being evil and bad. There's no depth to them besides just doing evil for evil's sake. Even like there were a few circumstances where, like, it doesn't make sense for you to do this evil bad stuff. But you're doing it anyways because you're an evil bad guy. And that's kind of what it felt like to me. So not a terrible thing. Didn't remember the story. She's like, oh, that's that thing that you'll learn later on as you're writing. Like, oh, that's going to improve at some point. Other than those issues, the story was pretty decent. Like I said, there are things that I enjoyed. There's a nice hook in the story where the main character wakes up crucified with his memories. It's not developed particularly well, I'm going to say, because it's something in the beginning and then she's like, oh, it kind of felt like it's eventually resolved towards the end. And I know it's one of those stories. She's like, the author was probably just writing it as, oh, this is a good hook. And then he went off and did other things and he kind of remembered at some point, oh, that's right. I should probably make sure that's resolved. And it is resolved. I'll give him that. Along with the memory stuff, but it almost feels like it's a casual incident of like, oh yeah, by the way, here's some resolution for these other things. So I'm like, oh, okay, that's fine. Again, a lot of those stories about the main character wandering from place to kind of quests, killing monsters, helping people, advancing his class stuff, all that's really decently done. There's a little bit of a revenge plot line, but that's really just a reason to go on more adventuring. But overall, it's just slice of life. And it gets a little dark mid to late story, which I think is going to again be it'll be an interesting thing for some readers who like that kind of stuff. I thought it was nice. I thought it was interesting. I should say, not nice. It's gruesome sometimes. But again, there are issues that just stopped me from enjoying it fully. And that's just, some of this stuff is just going to be me. Not everybody has those issues with RPG mechanics or unjustified OPness. And, like I said, there are people who really enjoy this. There are already good reviews day one for people who are on the Royal Road who liked it as he was reading it. And so that's definitely a plus in his favor. So if those issues don't bother you, go read it. Go give it a chance. Like, go download a sample if you're really kind of on the fence. So that, it's also on Kindle Unlimited. So it's not like it's a huge risk. But for me, I have to be honest. I can't, even though I like the guy, I have to be 100% honest in these reviews. So for me, it gets a score 6 out of 10. That's Varnoth, the Black Blade, book number 1. And again, a 6 out of 10 is not a negative review score. It's not boring, which is a 5. It's not bad, which is a 4. 6 really is just like, wasn't good for me, but you may like it. So there we go. 6 out of 10 for Varnoth, the Black Blade. There we go.